In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, where whispers of ghosts and greed intertwine, a young scholar lies dead. His fall from a library ladder, no mere accident. Enter Miss Jane Marple, her keen eyes piercing the fog of secrets. A cryptic note, a chipped bust, a hidden journal, and a second attack unravel a deadly web of family betrayal. As footsteps echo in the haunted East Wing, Miss Marple uncovers a truth darker than any spectre. A fortune worth killing for. Will she outwit a murderer before the manor claims another soul? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Manor. In the quiet village of Danefield, where the hedgerows bloomed with late autumn roses and the church bell tolled with comforting regularity, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest parlour. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the chintz curtains and the polished oak table where her knitting lay, a half-finished scarf in soft grey wool. Her fingers moved with practised ease, the needles clicking in a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. Beside her teacup, a letter lay open, its thick cream paper and elegant script betraying its importance. The envelope, edged in black, bore the postmark of Edinburgh, a city Miss Marple had visited only once, long ago, in her youth. The letter was from Lady Eleanor Guthrie, a school friend from those distant days at the Mrs. Rutherford's Academy for Young Ladies. Eleanor, then a spirited girl with a penchant for poetry, had married into the Guthrie family, old Scottish gentry whose name carried weight in Edinburgh's higher circles. The letter's tone was polite but urgent, its words carefully chosen yet tinged with unease. Eleanor begged Miss Marple's presence at Blackthorn Manor, the Guthrie family seat, for a matter requiring discretion and insight. She mentioned the recent death of her nephew, Alistair Guthrie, found lifeless in the manor's library. The police had called it an accident, a fall from a ladder while reaching for a book, but Eleanor's words hinted at doubt. "You have a way of seeing things, Jane," she wrote, "a way that cuts through shadows." Miss Marple folded the letter, her clear blue eyes thoughtful. She had no love for grand houses or their dramas, but Eleanor's plea stirred her curiosity. People she knew were rarely as simple as they seemed, and a death in a family like the Guthries was bound to reveal secrets. She rose, her movements spry despite her years, and began to pack a small suitcase with practical items. A woolen cardigan, her best hat, and a notebook for observations. Danefield's gossip could wait. Edinburgh called. The train journey north was a study in contrasts. Golden fields giving way to rugged hills, then the smoky bustle of Edinburgh's Waverley Station. As the cab rattled through the city's cobbled streets, Miss Marple noted the grey stone tenements and the distant outline of Arthur's Seat, shrouded in mist. Blackthorn Manor lay just beyond the city, perched on a wooded hill like a sentinel. Its Gothic silhouette emerged as the cab crested the rise, tall turrets, arched windows, and ivy clinging to weathered stone. The air carried a chill, and the iron gates creaked as they opened, as if reluctant to admit visitors. Lady Eleanor met her in the entrance hall, a cavernous space with a vaulted ceiling and a grand staircase of blackened oak. Eleanor was thinner than Miss Marple remembered, her silver hair pinned neatly, but her hands trembling as she clasped Miss Marple's. "Jane, you've come," she said, her voice warm but strained. "I knew you would." Over tea in a drawing-room adorned with faded tapestries, Eleanor shared the details. Alistair, her late brother's son, had been a scholar, devoted to the family's history. 3 weeks ago, he was found at the foot of the library ladder, his neck broken. The inquest was brief, the verdict unquestioned by all but Eleanor. "He was careful, Jane," she said, her eyes searching. "Alistair never climbed that ladder without checking it first. And there's talk. The servants whisper of noises, footsteps in the night. They say the manor is haunted." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind alert. She had heard such tales before. Ghost stories often masked human misdeeds. "Tell me about the household," she said gently. Eleanor described the family. Sir Malcolm Guthrie, her brother-in-law, a widower remarried to Clara, a former actress with a flair for dramatics, their son Douglas, a painter with a moody disposition, Beatrice, Alistair's young widow, who kept to herself, Dr. Hugh Ramsay, a family friend and local doctor, and Fiona MacLeod, the housekeeper, who had served the Guthries for decades. "They're all grieving," Eleanor said, "but it feels wrong." As the firelight danced, Miss Marple noted the hesitation in Eleanor's voice, the way her fingers twisted her lace handkerchief. Something unspoken hung in the air, as heavy as the manor's ancient beams. She agreed to stay a week, promising to observe quietly. Already, her mind was weaving connections, recalling a case in Danefield where a similar accident had unravelled into something far darker. Blackthorn Manor, with its shadows and secrets, promised a puzzle worthy of her attention. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The morning after her arrival at Blackthorn Manor, Miss Jane Marple descended the grand staircase, her sensible shoes silent on the thick runner. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and damp stone, and a faint chill lingered despite the fire roaring in the hall's massive hearth. Breakfast was to be served in the dining room, a cavernous space with tall windows that admitted a grey, filtered light. The table was set with fine china, but the mood, Miss Marple sensed, would be far less refined. She adjusted her shawl and prepared to meet the Guthrie household, her mind as sharp as the knitting, needles tucked in her bag. Lady Eleanor, her face pale but composed, ushered Miss Marple to her seat. The room gradually filled with the family, each member entering with a distinct air that Miss Marple catalogued with her usual precision. Sir Malcolm Guthrie, the patriarch, was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, his face weathered like the Scottish cliffs, his eyes clouded with a mix of grief and irritation. His tweed jacket was immaculate, but the faint scent of whisky clung to him, even at this early hour. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple, muttering about the inconvenience of guests during such times. His second wife, Clara, swept in with theatrical grace, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her silk dress, a shade too bright for mourning, rustled as she offered Miss Marple a dazzling smile that did not reach her eyes. Douglas Guthrie, Sir Malcolm's son, slouched in next, his dark hair unkempt and his painter's hands stained with traces of charcoal. He barely glanced at Miss Marple, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if the room held nothing of interest. Beatrice, Alistair's widow, entered quietly, her black dress accentuating her pallor. She clutched a silver locket, her fingers tracing its edges nervously, and her sharp green eyes darted about, settling briefly on each face before moving on. Dr. Hugh Ramsay, a wiry man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, arrived with an air of professional calm, offering Miss Marple a polite handshake. Finally, Fiona MacLeod, the housekeeper, glided in to oversee the meal, her severe bun and starched apron giving her the appearance of a dour governess. Her eyes, however, were keen, missing nothing. As the meal began, kippers, toast, and strong tea served with quiet efficiency, Miss Marple observed the undercurrents. Sir Malcolm spoke brusquely of estate matters, his voice cutting through the clink of cutlery. "The solicitors are dragging their feet," he grumbled, as if Alistair's affairs weren't complicated enough. Clara, stirring her tea with exaggerated care, remarked that Alistair had been so absorbed in his books, poor dear, he barely noticed the world. Her tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her glance toward Beatrice, who stiffened but said nothing. Douglas, pushing his plate away untouched, muttered, "He noticed enough to cause trouble." The words hung in the air, sharp and unguarded. Sir Malcolm shot his son a warning look, but Douglas merely shrugged, his lips curling into a faint sneer. Beatrice's hand tightened on her locket, and she murmured, "He was devoted to the family's history, that's all." Her voice was soft, but Miss Marple noted its edge, like a blade wrapped in velvet. Dr. Ramsay cleared his throat, offering a bland comment about the weather. But the tension remained, thick as the fog outside. Fiona, moving silently to refill the teapot, paused near Miss Marple. "The manners, old miss," she said in a low voice, her Scottish burr pronounced. "It holds its secrets, and not all of them kind. Folks say the East Wing's haunted, footsteps at night, shadows where none should be." Her eyes flicked toward the family, then back to Miss Marple, who smiled politely. She had heard such tales before, in villages like Danefield, where superstition often cloaked truth. Ghosts, she thought, were less troubling than the living, who carried their motives in their hearts. Miss Marple steered the conversation gently, her questions as unassuming as her demeanour. "Alistair's work must have been fascinating," she said, addressing Beatrice. "Did he share his discoveries with you?" Beatrice hesitated, her fingers pausing on the locket. "He was private about it," she said. "He spent hours in the library reading old journals. He said they held the key to the Guthrie legacy." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the quick glance she cast at Douglas, who stared at his plate. Clara laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, Alistair and his dusty books. He was always chasing some legend about the manor. A treasure, wasn't it? Pure fancy, if you ask me." Sir Malcolm snorted, dismissing the idea, but Miss Marple caught the way his knuckles whitened around his teacup. Dr. Ramsay interjected. "Alistair was under strain, you know. He mentioned sleepless nights, worries about money." He adjusted his spectacles, avoiding Beatrice's gaze. Miss Marple filed this away. Financial strain often bred desperation, and desperation bred conflict. As the meal ended, Fiona lingered, clearing plates with a deliberate slowness. Miss Marple, rising to return to her room, paused to thank her. "You've been with the family a long time, haven't you?" she asked, her tone mild. Fiona nodded, her face impassive. "Since I was a girl, miss. I know this house better than most." Her words carried a weight, and Miss Marple wondered what truths the housekeeper guarded behind her stern facade. Retiring to the drawing-room, Miss Marple sat by a window overlooking the misty gardens, her knitting resumed. The family's interactions replayed in her mind. Sir Malcolm's gruff dismissal, Clara's forced gaiety, Douglas's sullenness, Beatrice's guarded grief, Ramsay's careful neutrality, and Fiona's cryptic warnings. Each was a piece in a puzzle, their edges jagged with hidden resentments. She recalled a case in Danefield where a family's polite surface had concealed a web of jealousy and greed. Blackthorn Manor, with its creaking timbers and whispered hauntings, felt much the same. Eleanor joined her, her hands clasped tightly. "What do you think, Jane?" she asked, her voice low. "They're all so distant." Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile reassuring. "People are often distant when they carry burdens," she said. "I shall watch Eleanor and listen. The truth has a way of showing itself." As Eleanor nodded, grateful but anxious, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the portrait above the mantel. A stern Guthrie ancestor, his gaze as unyielding as the manor itself. She sensed that Alistair's death was no mere accident, and the family's secrets, like the manor's shadows, would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 3. The Scene of the Crime. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stood at the threshold of Blackthorn Manor's library, her keen eyes taking in the vast room. The morning light struggled through tall mullioned windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Shelves of leather-bound books stretched to the high ceiling, their spines worn but meticulously arranged. A musty scent of old paper and wax hung in the air, mingling with a faint trace of something sharper, perhaps polish, perhaps something else. Lady Eleanor, hovering anxiously at her side, had agreed to show her the place where Alistair Guthrie met his end. "It's just as it was," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The police looked, but they didn't linger." The library was dominated by a heavy oak table, its surface cluttered with papers and an inkstand. At the far end stood the ladder, a sturdy but aged contraption of wood and iron, its top rung level with the highest shelves. Miss Marple approached it, her steps deliberate, noting the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her. The spot where Alistair's body had been found was unmarked, yet she could almost sense its outline at the ladder's base. She knelt, her fingers brushing the floor, and observed faint scuff marks in the dust, irregular and smudged, as if something or someone had been dragged. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft but alert. Rising, she examined the ladder itself. Its rungs were solid, with no sign of splintering or wear that might suggest a collapse. Eleanor confirmed Alistair's caution, noting he always tested the ladder before climbing. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a nearby shelf, where a gap between books caught her eye. The ledge was curiously clean, free of the dust that coated its neighbours. Her fingers traced the edge, and she noticed a heavy bronze bust of some long-forgotten Guthrie, placed haphazardly on the floor. Its base bore a small chip, the metal glinting as if recently struck. "This was here when he was found?" she asked. Eleanor nodded, her brow furrowing. "The police thought he might have knocked it down in his fall." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A fall might dislodge a bust, but the chip suggested force, not accident. She moved to the table, where Alistair's papers lay scattered, a mix of genealogical notes and sketches of the manor's east wing. Tucked beneath a volume of Scottish history, she found a crumpled scrap of paper, its edges torn. In a hurried script, it read, "Meet me at midnight." The ink was dark, fresh, not faded by time. She slipped it into her sleeve, deciding to keep it from Eleanor for now. The note's existence suggested a clandestine meeting, and clandestine meetings, in her experience, often preceded trouble. Was Alistair working on anything particular? Miss Marple asked, her tone as mild as if she were inquiring about the weather. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke of Alistair's fascination with the Guthrie family's past, particularly a legend of a hidden legacy, a cache of documents or perhaps something more valuable, tied to the manor's first lord. He spent hours here, she said, poring over journals, muttering about a key to the family's honour. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling a case in Danefield where a man's obsession with lineage had led to bitter rivalries. Secrets, she knew, were as potent as poison in a house like this. They left the library, Eleanor locking the door behind them. As they walked down the corridor, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The scuff marks, the chipped bust, the note, all pointed to something staged, something deliberate. Alistair's death was no mere misstep, but the work of someone who knew the library's shadows. At luncheon, served in the same sombre dining room, Miss Marple steered the conversation with her usual deftness. "Such a grand library," she remarked, buttering a scone. "Alistair must have been proud of it." Sir Malcolm grunted, his fork pausing. He wasted too much time there, digging up old nonsense. The Guthries have no need for fairy tales. Clara, her smile tight, added, "He was always scribbling, locking himself away." It drove poor Beatrice to distraction. Beatrice's eyes flashed, but she said only, "He loved his work." Douglas, slouched in his chair, smirked. "Work! He was chasing ghosts, thinking he'd find gold in those mouldy books." His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed the table, restless. Dr. Ramsay, slicing his roast with precision, mentioned Alistair's recent distraction, as if something weighed on him. "He asked me about sedatives once," Ramsay said, "but I thought it was just fatigue." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving connections. Fatigue could mask worry, and worry could mask fear. The note suggested Alistair had met someone that night, someone who might have pushed him, using the bust to ensure the fall was fatal. The clean shelf hinted at something removed, perhaps a book or object tied to his research. She recalled a Danefield widow who staged an accident to hide a theft. The parallels were striking. As the meal ended, she caught Fiona's eye. The housekeeper clearing plates moved with a quiet intensity, her gaze lingering on Beatrice, who clutched her locket as if it were a talisman. Returning to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The manor's walls seemed to hum with secrets, each occupant a thread in a tangled skein. Alistair's death, she felt certain, was tied to his research, perhaps to the legacy he sought. The note, the bust, the scuff marks, they were clues, but incomplete. Someone in Blackthorn Manor had wanted Alistair silenced, and Miss Marple suspected the answer lay not in the library's books, but in the hearts of those who dined with her today. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Night. Miss Jane Marple sat by the mullioned window of her guest room at Blackthorn Manor, her knitting needles idle in her lap. The night was deep, the moon obscured by heavy clouds that pressed against the Edinburgh hills. The manor creaked and groaned, its ancient timbers settling like an old man's bones. A faint tapping echoed from somewhere deep within the house, rhythmic yet elusive, and Miss Marple's sharp ears caught it at once. She set her knitting aside, her mind alert, and donned her shawl, its soft wool a comfort against the chill. The hour was late, well past midnight, and the household, she presumed, was asleep. Yet the tapping suggested otherwise. With a small candle in hand, its flame flickering in the draughty corridor, Miss Marple stepped out, her slippers silent on the worn carpet. The manor's passages were a labyrinth of shadowed turns, the walls adorned with stern portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. The tapping grew clearer as she neared the east wing, a part of the house Eleanor had described as rarely used. It was here, local gossip claimed, that the manor's ghostly reputation was born. Footsteps heard, lights glimpsed where none should be. Miss Marple, ever sceptical of spectres, suspected human hands behind such tales. At the end of the corridor she paused. A faint glow spilled from beneath a door, one she knew led to a disused parlour. The tapping ceased, replaced by a soft rustle, like fabric brushing stone. Creeping closer, she saw Fiona MacLeod, the housekeeper, her severe bun glinting in the candlelight she carried. Fiona unlocked the door with a key from her apron pocket and slipped inside. Miss Marple, her curiosity outweighing caution, waited a moment before easing the door open a crack. The parlour was dim, its furniture draped in dust sheets, but Fiona stood by a wall, her hands probing a panel. A low moan drifted through the room, not ghostly, Miss Marple noted, but human, tinged with frustration. Fiona muttered something indistinct, then extinguished her candle and left, locking the door behind her. Miss Marple retreated to her room, her heart steady, but her mind racing. Fiona's nocturnal wanderings suggested knowledge of the manor's secrets, perhaps tied to Alistair's research. The moan, the locked room, the housekeeper's furtive movements. They were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss them as mere superstition. She recalled a case in Danefield, where a servant's late-night errands had uncovered a hidden will. Blackthorn Manor, she suspected, held similar surprises. The next morning, over a breakfast of porridge and weak tea, Miss Marple observed the household with renewed focus. Sir Malcolm was absent, called away to a meeting with the estate's solicitor. Clara, her laughter brittle, complained of the manor's gloom, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting an escape. Douglas sketched idly on a napkin, his strokes sharp and restless, while Beatrice, her locket ever present, ate in silence, her gaze fixed on her plate. Dr. Ramsay, joining them late, mentioned a patient in town but offered the little else, his manner distracted. Fiona moved about her duties, her face as unreadable as stone, though Miss Marple caught her glancing at the east wing corridor. Seizing a moment alone with Dr. Ramsay after the meal, Miss Marple inquired about Alistair's health before his death. Her tone was gentle, as if chatting about a neighbour's ailment. "He seemed troubled, didn't he?" she said, her eyes meeting his over her teacup. Ramsay adjusted his spectacles, hesitating. "He came to me a few weeks before," he admitted. "Couldn't sleep, said his mind wouldn't rest. He spoke of family pressures, debts, I think, and something about proving his worth to the Guthries." He paused, then added, "I prescribed a mild tonic, but he didn't return." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her thoughts sharp. Debts and family pressures were fertile ground for motive, and Alistair's insomnia suggested a man burdened by more than dusty journals. She thanked Ramsay, noting the slight flush in his cheeks, as if he regretted saying so much. As he left, she considered the household anew. Clara's extravagance, Douglas's resentment, Beatrice's guarded sorrow, Fiona's secrecy, and now Ramsay's hint of Alistair's financial strain. Each was a thread, and the note she'd found, "Meet me at midnight," was a knot tying them together. That afternoon, while the family was occupied, Miss Marple slipped into the east wing, her steps cautious. The parlour door was locked, as expected, but she examined the frame, finding faint scratches near the latch, as if it had been forced open before. The corridor itself was dusty, but a faint trail of footprints, small, likely a woman's, led to the door. She made a mental note to watch Fiona more closely, suspecting the housekeeper knew more than she let on. At dinner, the atmosphere was strained, the clink of silverware loud against the silence. Miss Marple, her demeanour as unassuming as ever, mentioned the manor's history, hoping to draw out reactions. "Such an old house must have many stories," she said, smiling at Clara. The former actress brightened, launching into a tale of a Guthrie ancestor who vanished in the East Wing centuries ago. "They say his spirit lingers," she added, her eyes gleaming with theatrical flair. Douglas scoffed, muttering about foolish fancies, while Beatrice's hand tightened on her locket, her lips pale. Fiona, serving the soup, said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly. As Miss Marple retired for the night, she sat by her window, the manor's shadows pooling around her. The tapping had not resumed, but Fiona's actions and Ramsay's revelations weighed on her. Alistair's death, she felt certain, was tied to his pursuit of the Guthrie legacy, and someone, perhaps someone at that very table, had ensured his silence. The East Wing held answers, she was sure, and Fiona's role was no mere servant's duty. With her knitting resumed, the needles clicking softly, Miss Marple planned her next move, her mind as clear as the candlelight beside her. Chapter 5. The Hidden Journal. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Blackthorn Manor, casting a pallid light across the breakfast table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her teacup cradled in her hands. The household was subdued, as Sir Malcolm had announced the family's departure for a memorial service in Edinburgh to honour Alistair Guthrie. The absence of the Guthries, Clara, Beatrice, Douglas and Dr. Ramsay, provided Miss Marple with a rare opportunity. She declined Eleanor's invitation to join them, citing a slight headache, though her eyes sparkled with purpose. "I shall rest and perhaps explore the library again," she said, her voice mild, but her mind alight with intent. With the manor quiet, save for the soft tread of Fiona MacLeod's footsteps somewhere distant, Miss Marple returned to the library. The room felt colder today, its high shelves looming like silent sentinels. She moved with purpose, her small frame dwarfed by the towering bookcases, and began a methodical search. Alistair's papers scattered on the oak table offered little new, genealogical charts, notes on the Guthrie lineage, and references to a key to the legacy. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a lower shelf near the ladder, where the dust was disturbed, as if a book had been recently moved. Kneeling, she ran her fingers along the panel behind the shelf. A faint click rewarded her persistence, and a section of wood swung inward, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside lay a slim, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the Guthrie crest. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She settled at the table, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and opened the journal. Alistair's handwriting filled the pages, precise yet hurried, detailing his research into a family legend. a treasure hidden by Lord Roderick Guthrie, the manor's founder, said to secure the family's claim to a lost fortune. The entries spoke of a locked chest in the east wing, possibly containing deeds or jewels, and cryptic references to a family curse that guarded it. One passage caught her eye. "She knows more than they admit. Meeting at midnight to discuss the chest. If I'm right, this changes everything." The initial C stood out starkly. Clara, with her financial troubles? Or could it be someone else? Another entry mentioned Alistair's fear of betrayal, his suspicion that eyes watch me in this house. Miss Marple closed the journal, tucking it into her bag. The note she'd found, "Meet me at midnight," now seemed a prelude to Alistair's fate, and the journal was the thread tying it to the manor's secrets. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Eleanor alone, the others still at the service. She shared the journal's existence, though not its full contents, gauging her friend's reaction. Eleanor's face paled, her hands twisting her lace handkerchief. "A treasure," she murmured. "Alistair spoke of it once, but I thought it a myth. The Guthries have always whispered of Roderick's fortune, documents proving our claim to lands lost centuries ago. But it's folklore, Jane, surely." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the fear in her eyes, as if the legend carried a weight she dared not name. "Folklore often hides truth," Miss Marple said gently, her mind recalling a Danefield case where a family tale of hidden gold had sparked deadly greed. She asked about the East Wing's locked rooms, and Eleanor admitted they were rarely opened, used only for storage. "Fiona has the keys," she added, "but she's fiercely protective of the house." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions about the housekeeper deepening. Fiona's nighttime wanderings, the scratches on the parlour door, and now the journal's mention of a chest, all pointed to a secret someone was desperate to keep or uncover. As the family returned, their voices echoing in the hall, Miss Marple observed them anew. Clara's laughter was forced, her eyes darting to Sir Malcolm, who looked weary, his whisky glass already in hand. Douglas slouched past, muttering about the pointless service, while Beatrice, her locket clutched tightly, avoided Miss Marple's gaze. Dr. Ramsay, lingering to speak with Eleanor, seemed distracted, his fingers adjusting his spectacles repeatedly. At dinner, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the manor's history, mentioning Lord Roderick casually. "Such tales of hidden wealth must be thrilling," she said, watching for reactions. Sir Malcolm scoffed. "Roderick was a fool, chasing dreams. There's no treasure here, only debts." Clara's smile tightened, and she changed the subject to Edinburgh's theatres. Douglas, unusually vocal, said, "Alistair thought he'd save us all with his precious journals. Look where it got him." Beatrice flinched, her voice sharp. "He was trying to honour our name, not chase riches." Her defence felt rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the tension between her and Douglas, like a wire stretched taut. Fiona, serving the meal, moved silently, but Miss Marple caught her pausing near the mention of the treasure, her hands steady but her eyes alert. As the evening ended, Miss Marple retired, her thoughts swirling. The journal confirmed Alistair's death was no accident. Someone had met him that night, someone tied to sea, someone who knew of the chest. Clara's debts, Douglas's bitterness, Beatrice's guardedness, Fiona's secrecy, each was a suspect, each a piece in a puzzle that grew darker by the hour. Sitting by her window, the manor's shadows deepening outside, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needle's rhythm steadying her as she planned her next step. The east wing, she decided, would yield more answers, and she would watch Fiona closely, for the housekeeper's keys might unlock more than doors. Chapter 6. A Second Tragedy. The dining room at Blackthorn Manor was cloaked in the heavy silence of an uneasy truce as Miss Jane Marple joined the Guthrie household for dinner. The long table, lit by flickering candelabra, cast eerie shadows on the panelled walls, and the air held a chill despite the fire blazing in the hearth. Sir Malcolm, at the head, sipped his whisky with a scowl, while Clara, her auburn hair catching the light, chatted brightly about a recent Edinburgh gala, her words a thin veneer over the tension. Douglas, his sketchbook abandoned for once, picked at his food, his dark eyes darting toward Beatrice, who sat rigid, her locket a constant in her restless hands. Dr. Ramsay, ever the observer, ate methodically, his spectacles glinting as he glanced at the others. Fiona MacLeod moved about her duties, her face a mask of stoic efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she poured wine. The meal was halfway through, roast lamb and minted peas, when a piercing scream shattered the quiet. It came from the east wing, sharp and raw, cutting through the manor's thick walls. Sir Malcolm's glass clattered to the table, and Clara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Douglas was on his feet first, his chair scraping, followed by Ramsay, who called for calm. Miss Marple, her heart steady, rose with quiet purpose, her shawl slipping slightly as she followed the others toward the sound. In the east wing corridor, dimly lit by a single sconce, they found Fiona crumpled at the foot of the narrow staircase, her apron askew and a bruise blooming on her temple. A silver candlestick lay nearby, its base dented. Dr. Ramsay knelt beside her, his fingers probing for a pulse. "She's alive," he said, his voice clipped as he loosened her collar. Fiona stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and murmured, "A shadow. It moved so fast." Her words were slurred, and she clutched at Ramsay's arm before sinking back into unconsciousness. Miss Marple, standing back, observed the scene with her usual clarity. The staircase was steep, its steps uneven with age, but the candlestick's dent suggested more than a fall. She bent to examine it, noting a faint smear of blood on its edge, barely visible in the dim light. A subtle scent lingered in the air. Lavender, delicate but distinct, the same perfume Clara wore. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. She recalled a Danefield incident where a staged accident had masked an assault, and the parallels here were unmistakable. As Ramsay revived Fiona with smelling salts, the housekeeper's gaze darted toward Beatrice, who stood pale and silent at the edge of the group. Sir Malcolm demanded answers, his voice booming. "What was she doing here at this hour?" Fiona, now sitting up, her face drawn, muttered about checking the parlour for drafts. "I saw someone in the dark," she said, her voice trembling. "Then I fell." Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way Fiona's eyes avoided the family, settling instead on the staircase. Eleanor, wringing her hands, insisted Fiona be taken to her room, and Ramsay agreed, supporting the housekeeper as they retreated. The family dispersed, Clara's nervous chatter filling the silence, while Douglas muttered about cursed houses. Beatrice lingered, her fingers tracing her locket, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, returning to the dining room, paused to examine the corridor's floor. The dust was disturbed, not by Fiona's fall alone, but by faint footprints, smaller than a man's, perhaps a woman's, leading to the parlour door. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched as her mind pieced together the evening's events. Fiona's accident felt staged, much like Alistair's death. The candlestick, the lavender scent, the footprints, they suggested someone had struck Fiona, perhaps to silence her knowledge of the East Wing's secrets. The journal's mention of a chest, Fiona's nighttime wanderings, and now this attack pointed to a desperate act. Clara's perfume was a clue, but Miss Marple cautioned herself against hasty conclusions. Beatrice's nervous demeanour and Douglas's hostility also bore watching, and Ramsay's quick intervention raised questions about his role. She recalled Alistair's journal, its cryptic reference to sea and a midnight meeting. If Clara was involved, her financial straits might drive her to violence, but Beatrice's guarded grief and Fiona's secretive actions suggested deeper currents. The East Wing, with its locked rooms and whispered hauntings, was the heart of the mystery, and Miss Marple resolved to explore it further. As the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, she resumed her knitting. The needle's steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the storm brewing within Blackthorn's walls. Someone, she knew, was watching, waiting, and willing to strike again. Chapter 7. The Unravelling. Miss Jane Marple stood before the drawing-room fire at Blackthorn Manor, her small figure framed by the leaping flames. The morning was raw, with a wind rattling the tall windows, yet every member of the household had been summoned. Sir Malcolm, heavy-eyed and impatient, nursed a glass of soda water. Clara, wrapped in a violet dressing-gown, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Douglas lounged against the mantelpiece, arms folded, a sneer barely concealed. Beatrice sat rigid on a straight-backed chair, the locket at her throat clenched in white fingers. Dr. Ramsay stood behind her, spectacles catching the light. Fiona MacLeod, a strip of plaster on her temple, hovered by the door, her gaze fixed on the carpet. Lady Eleanor, pale but resolute, had placed Miss Marple in charge of the gathering, and the old lady's gentle voice now filled the room with quiet authority. "I have asked you all here," she began, "because two violent events have occurred under this roof, and it is time the truth was spoken plainly." Sir Malcolm gave an impatient grunt. "The police called Alistair's death an accident, and Fiona took a tumble on the stairs. What more is there to say?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "A great deal, Sir Malcolm. Accidents do not leave scuff marks where none should be. They do not chip bronze busts. They do not plant crumpled notes demanding midnight meetings. And they do not strike a loyal servant on the temple with her own candlestick." A stir ran round the room. Clara's handkerchief fluttered to the floor. Douglas straightened. Beatrice's breath caught audibly. "Let us begin with the library," Miss Marple continued, unruffled. "Alistair Guthrie was found at the foot of the ladder, neck broken. The police saw a simple fall. I saw something else. The ladder firm, the floor scuffed as though a body had been dragged, and a bust of Lord Roderick chipped as if used to weight the fall. Then there was the note, 'Meet me at midnight,' written in fresh ink and hidden beneath papers. Someone arranged to be alone with Alistair that night." She turned to Beatrice. "You told me, my dear, that your husband was private about his work, yet he wrote in his journal, 'Discovered behind a false panel, that C knew more than they admitted, and that a meeting would settle everything. C is an initial that appears nowhere else in the journal, but it appears in this house. Clara gave a nervous laugh. Really, Miss Marple, initials are 2 a penny. You cannot hang a woman on a letter. Perhaps not, Miss Marple replied, but one may hang a motive on it. Alistair was tracing a legend. A chest hidden in the east wing containing proof of the Guthrie claim to the forfeited barony of Glenorchy. Land's worth a fortune today. He believed the chest held jewels and deeds. Someone else believed it too, and believed Alistair stood in the way. Douglas broke in, voice harsh. He stood in everyone's way, prating about family honour while the estate bled money. Beatrice was sick of his obsession. Clara wanted cash for her gowns. Father wanted the whole nonsense buried. Take your pick. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. Precisely, Mr. Douglas. Greed, jealousy, fear, any might serve. Yet only one person met Alistair at midnight. Only one person knew the library's shadows well enough to stage a fatal push and a convincing accident. She moved to the table where she had laid the bronze bust, the crumpled note, and Alistair's journal. The journal speaks of a midnight meeting with C. The note confirms it. The bust bears a chip and a trace of hair, dark like Alistair's. The ladder shows no defect. Someone climbed behind him, struck him with the bust, and let him fall. Sir Malcolm's face purpled. This is monstrous. You accuse my family. I accuse no one yet, Miss Marple said calmly. I merely state facts. Let us turn to last night. Fiona was struck down on the east wing stair. She saw a shadow. I smelled lavender, Mrs. Clara Guthrie's perfume, on the air. The candlestick was dented and blood-stained. Footprints, small, a woman's, led to the locked parlour. Fiona has been searching that room by night, using her keys. She knows where the chest is hidden. Fiona's head jerked up. I never. You did, Miss Marple said gently. You heard voices the night Alistair died. Clara's voice, pleading, then angry. You saw her leave the library after the fall. You kept silent out of loyalty until Clara feared you would speak. Last night she followed you, struck you and fled. Clara sprang to her feet. Lies! I was in my room. Your maid will confirm you were not, Miss Marple said. She heard you return at 2 a.m, your gown stained with candle wax and a trace of blood at the hem. Dr. Ramsay stepped forward. Miss Marple, this is conjecture. Is it? She opened the journal to a marked page. Alistair wrote 3 days before his death. C offered to buy the chest's contents, sight unseen, $5,000. I refused. She grows desperate. $5,000 would clear Mrs. Guthrie's dressmaker's bills and her gaming debts at the assembly rooms. Desperation breeds violence, Doctor. Clara's composure cracked. He was going to ruin us all with his precious papers. Malcolm would have sold the manor to pay the mortgages. I only wanted what was mine. Sir Malcolm stared at her stunned. You killed my nephew? I pushed him, Clara whispered, tears starting. He turned on the ladder, mocked me. The bust was in my hand before I knew it. I struck once, and he fell. Then I dragged him clear, arranged the scene. Fiona saw me leave. Last night I had to silence her. Beatrice gave a low cry and buried her face in her hands. Douglas swore under his breath. Fiona, trembling, said, I wanted no part of murder, ma'am. I only kept the east wing key because the chest is there, behind the false chimney in the parlour. I thought to protect the family. Miss Marple turned to Sir Malcolm. The police will find the chest where Fiona says. The jewels and deeds will restore the Guthrie fortune, but not its honour. That, I fear, is lost." Sir Malcolm sank into a chair, an old man suddenly. "Take her away," he said hoarsely. "Let the law do its easy work." As Clara was led out, sobbing, Miss Marple gathered her knitting. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and Blackthorn Manor seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The ghosts, she reflected, had been human after all. Chapter 8. The Resolution. The drawing-room at Blackthorn Manor was hushed. The fire now reduced to glowing embers as Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking softly in the fading light. The police had come and gone, their heavy boots echoing through the halls as they escorted Clara Guthrie away, her wrists bound and her face a mask of defiance and despair. The air was thick with the aftermath of truth, the kind that leaves a family fractured and a house forever changed. Lady Eleanor, her eyes red-rimmed, sat opposite Miss Marple, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while the others, Sir Malcolm, Douglas, Beatrice and Dr. Ramsay, had retreated to their rooms, each grappling with the revelations and solitude. Miss Marple's serene demeanour belied the sharpness of her thoughts as she reviewed the events. The chest, as Fiona had promised, had been found behind a false panel in the East Wing's parlour. A heavy oak box inlaid with the Guthrie crest, containing a collection of sapphires and yellow deeds proving the family's claim to the lost barony of Glenorchy. The jewels glittered coldly in the lamplight when opened, their value undeniable, yet they brought no joy. Sir Malcolm had stared at them, his face ashen, muttering about the cost of greed. Beatrice, clutching her locket, had turned away, as if the sight burned her. Douglas, for once silent, had merely shaken his head, his cynicism replaced by a weary resignation. Eleanor broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Jane, how did you see it all so clearly? We lived with her, and yet—" She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the portrait of Lord Roderick above the mantel, his stern eyes seeming to judge them all. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her smile gentle but firm. "People, my dear Eleanor, are not so different from one village to another. In Danefield, I've seen how secrets fester, how a smile can hide a scheming heart. Clara's debts were whispered about in Edinburgh, her charm a mask for desperation. Alistair's journal, the note, the chipped bust, they were signposts pointing to someone who saw wealth as salvation. Fiona's silence, born of loyalty, nearly cost her life, but it also preserved the truth." Eleanor nodded, her lips trembling. "And poor Alistair, he only wanted to restore our name." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "but his obsession stirred fears. Clara saw ruin in his refusal to sell the chest's contents. She acted not out of malice, but panic, a moment's choice that broke everything." She paused, her eyes distant. "I recall a woman in Danefield, driven to theft by debt. She wept when caught, much like Clara. The heart wants what it cannot have, and sometimes it destroys to get it. The police inspector, a dour man named MacDougall, had confirmed the details. Clara's confession in the drawing-room was enough to secure her arrest, but the evidence, Alistair's journal, the bloodied candlestick, the lavender-scented gown found in her wardrobe, sealed her fate. Fiona, shaken but cooperative, had led them to the chest, her loyalty to the Guthries outweighing her fear. The deeds, verified by a solicitor, promised to clear the estate's mortgages, but Sir Malcolm had waved the news away. his spirit broken by betrayal. Beatrice, before retiring, had approached Miss Marple in the hall, her voice low. "I argued with Alistair that night," she admitted, her fingers tracing the locket. "I thought his search was madness, tearing us apart. I left him alive, I swear." Miss Marple had patted her hand, believing her. "Grief makes us doubt ourselves, my dear," she said. "You loved him. Hold to that." Beatrice had nodded, tears falling, and vowed to honour Alistair's memory by preserving the manor's legacy. Douglas, meanwhile, had retreated to his studio, his sketches now filled with the manor's turrets and shadows, as if purging his anger through charcoal. Dr. Ramsay, ever the professional, offered to stay on, tending to Fiona's recovery and Eleanor's frayed nerves. Fiona herself, her bruise fading, resumed her duties with a quiet dignity, though Miss Marple sensed she would never speak of the East Wing's secrets again. As Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her modest belongings neatly arranged, Eleanor pressed her hands warmly. "You've saved us, Jane, though it hurts to say it. Without you, we'd have lived with lies." Miss Marple demurred, her smile modest. "I only saw what was there, Eleanor. People hide their truths, but they leave traces, scuff marks, scents, glances. One need only look." The train back to Danefield wound through the misty hills, the Edinburgh skyline fading behind. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed, the grey scarf lengthening with each steady click. Blackthorn Manor, with its ghosts and greed, was behind her, but its lessons lingered. Human nature, she reflected, was the true haunt, more treacherous than any spectre. As the countryside rolled past, she thought of her quiet cottage, the roses in her garden, and the next puzzle that might find her, for life, like her knitting, always had another stitch to unravel.